I wrote a book back in 1986, America's Trade Crisis. It was a totally different game then. And one thing about speaking, after you write a book, you got so much up there in your mind that starts to pour out. So you have to have guidelines so you don't go overboard on it. And I'm guided by two principles. One, when I served in Congress, I was in the House of Representatives. And when you took to the floor to speak, 5 minutes, that was it. Over on the Senate, if you get up to speak, it's unlimited. And that's why I ran for the Senate twice. Never made it, so I have to adhere to the 5 minutes. The other guideline, when I ran statewide in 1972, I was kind of young and naive, but running for this office, nobody cared about Secretary of State, but I had to impress people with all my knowledge. And I remember this speech in Spokane before. It was an elderly men's club, about 18 older guys out there. And I started to ramble on, and I could see a few of them had fallen asleep. Others were dozing, but I just kept going. And at the end, this guy, he must have been 86, 87, with a cane, he hobbled up to the podium. Young man, I'm giving you advice. When you make a speech, 3 points. That's it, no more. You understand? And he turned around and hobbled off, and I said to my campaign, who is that? You don't know who that is? That's Senator Clarence Dill. He was renowned nationwide for his oracle skills. What did he say again? So I'm going to keep it to 3 points. First, the memoir, as Doug pointed out. It started that way as a family legacy, because I'm looking down several generations. Great-great-grandchild gets up and says, he was a congressman? What was that all about? But once I started getting into the various chapters, it took it on a different direction, more meaning, a sense of purpose. But a pivotal moment was in Kazakhstan a few years ago. I was a speaker at an economic forum, and another speaker was a Financial Times senior editor. His name is on the book, David Applefield. And so we were there for a few days. He looked at a couple of chapters, and he got back to me when he was in Paris. Said, I want to get involved in your book. And did he ever? It stretched it out another 9 months. But it was well worth it. And I like to say that my experience is like putting all the bones on the table, but he made it, he put the flesh on the bones. Now it's more digestible. He not gotten involved. There's a lot to cover, but again, very brief. One thing I did in the book, and it came at the end, I realized a select number of senators and congressmen I worked with who they had principle, moral character. I saw them up close, how they put the national interest, the common good, above whatever political ambition or self-interest. And I highlight 6 of them in this Profiles of Character. Remember John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage? Well, this is Profiles of Character. And I got to see that up close, and it really had a tremendous influence on my life. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is the early career. The chapter says, dance studio to the courthouse. Okay, I started out as a dance instructor in Denver, Colorado, dance studios, and that was quite an experience and very interesting to read. And that went on for about a year, and there was an awakening. I realized I was in fantasy land. I had to get on with my life, college, but where, how? And I had an absentee father whom I'd never met, and he moved from Denver out to Vancouver, and about the time I was getting ready for a change, I got a letter from him. He would help if I come out to Vancouver, Washington. And I did. and enrolled at Clark College. So on that first week, they had a get acquainted dance, and he said, please go to that dance, because he's afraid I wouldn't stay. I would just take off and get bored. And so I went to the get acquainted dance, and now here's the scene. I was kind of a traditionalist, the foxtrot, the waltz, you know, but they were doing all this hipster twist stuff, and somehow I got into an argument with the guy, and we had to fight. Actually, I hit him, he went down, had to go to the hospital and get some stitches. But a few days later, we appeared before the dean of students, and he got put on probation because he was drinking. And the dean turned to me and he said, young man, you want to change the music around here? You march across the hallway, get involved in student government. That's how we do things. And that's how I got started in politics. And so I made my way through college and went back and worked for a U.S. Senator for a year, and then returned to run for county auditor. And that I faced insurmountable odds, which is interesting reading, actually. But somehow, let me just cite one experience. I went in to see the county chairman, and we had a little exchange of words about Washington, and then I said, I'm here to announce I'm going to run for county auditor. And he wasn't pleased. And finally, he said, no, I've got a candidate for that office. You wait until it's your turn. And I persisted. And finally, he said, if you run for that office, I personally will guarantee your career is over before it begins. This is the county party chairman in a day when chairman has real power. So I get in the car and I'm driving out to my father's house, and I'm thinking, I'm so young, I'm experienced, I don't have any support, I'm running up against this guy, the chairman. What am I doing? And so I drive into the driveway, into the house, and I asked my stepmother, where's Dad? Oh, he's outside, he's been there all day. And I walked out the yard, and all over the lawn, he just painted Don Bunker for county auditor signs. So I thought, I better stay. And I won. And then, and I also pioneered some things. It was a new age. I was the first in the country to use computerized voting. It gave me a lot of, something of a platform politically statewide. And then 8 years later, I ran for Congress again. The odds were insurmountable. I was running against the two most powerful Democratic state senators. One was a majority leader, the other was head of the caucus, and he was a tremendous guy, incidentally. And again, why am I running against these odds? But it was a Watergate year, 1974, and there was a political tsunami that swept across America's heartland and ushered in 79 newly elected young Democrats. That would not have happened if it weren't for Watergate. So I was a beneficiary. And when I look back over my career, I can say that I won those races I should have lost. At the end of my career, I lost those races I should have won. So somehow things balance out. Okay, on to accomplishments. Of course, I could go 3 hours. Yeah, I got to stay within my 3 points. It was a serendipity that got me on the Foreign Affairs Committee. That's another wonderful story. But eventually I became chairman of the Human Rights Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs. And it happened to be at the time Carter came into the White House. And what he really wanted to do is make human rights the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And but he couldn't do it all by himself. Today's a little different. He needed congressional support. So I took the lead while I was chairman of that subcommittee to make human rights more integrated into our foreign policy. And then I became chairman of the subcommittee on trade. It put me in a quandary because I'm something of a free trade Democrat, and the Democratic Party was marching down the path of protectionism. So it was put me in a quandary, but nonetheless, the Speaker made me chairman of the Speaker's Task Force on Trade, which led to enactment of the Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1986. But now, closer to home, our state's precious natural resources. Again, a quandary. Southwest Washington, when I was in Congress, a lot of timber, and that was essential to the economies of these areas. Aberdeen, Pacific County, Longview, they all depended on timber for their lumber mills. And but I was feeling the pressure to try to protect some of these precious resources. And eventually, we passed 5 or 6 major environmental bills, including the Columbia River National Scenic Area, the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument Act, and then we had Grays Harbor Wildlife Refuge, and then Protection Island and a few others. Now, they may not mean much to you, but believe me, these were landmark accomplishments. And I have to say, even though I took the lead on the House side, the true hero on this was a Republican Senator Dan Evans, the former governor, because his political base wasn't all for protecting the environment, it was more for business. But he was able to support and manage to get passed through the Senate and signed by Ronald Reagan these major accomplishments. Okay, now we're on to point number 3. We're winding down. No way to ignore what it was like when I served in the Congress compared to what it's like today. Politics has always been contentious, going all the way back to our founding fathers. As you know, if you read the books on Alexander Hamilton, on John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, it was really contentious. And so much that there were a lot of disputes and feuds that would lead to a duel. And the one founding father who was quoted more on the Senate floor this last 2 weeks was Alexander Hamilton. And he had this feud with Aaron Barr that ended in a duel, and it ended Alexander Hamilton's life. But yes, we've had this as part of our political system, I think probably in any democracy. You know, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So it definitely has its flaws. But when I served, another Washington State person, Congressman Tom Foley, was Speaker of the House. And it was a moment of civility. And he was so respected across the political spectrum. Even Henry Hyde, a conservative Republican, once said, "I wish Tom Foley were a Republican." But he commanded that respect and trust, not only across the aisle, but over in the Senate and working with the White House. Of course, we have our differences. That's the Christine knows in the state legislature. But we have to somehow work out or work through those differences. And with that kind of leadership, we were making accomplishments. And of course, we don't see that today. And several factors. One, that pivotal moment occurred in 1994. Tom Foley was replaced by Newt Gingrich. He made it very clear. He wanted to see the House to be a battleground. He ripped apart all the bipartisanship efforts that were underway at the time. There were so many descriptions of how volatile he was politically, how disruptive. That quotes out of the Atlantic. I just found so many quotes that I had to reduce them to just a few in my book. But what we saw is that civility was replaced by and we've not recovered from it. It's only gotten worse. Now, of course, we see in our culture it's more polarized than we've ever seen before. And that's across America's heartland. And then it spills over into the nation's capital. And now it's highly politicized. Thank you, Larry. It's now, I'm surprised my daughter didn't remind me. I got to hold it up for her. And now that polarization, which is cultural, is now highly partisan in Washington, D.C., to where we're almost at a paralysis. The other thing is we're in a digital age. That's what's fueling this polarization. There's relentless hacking. The manipulation of social media is kind of shaping the new political order. It's no longer based on truth and civility and so forth. It's all on how we manipulate the news. And I was down last month to have time with the owner of the Columbian newspaper in Vancouver. And what he shared with me is what's happening across America. His revenue's down 50%. Subscriptions are down as society is converting more to social media, less reliant on traditional news sources that had a reputation for truth and facts. And so this has become a major factor in this deterioration of our democracy. And when I was chairman of that Committee of Human Rights, it was at the time in South America. It was a time when the military juntas there in Chile and Argentina and Brazil, they were all military, but they were transitioning to more of a democracy. And you just can't build a democracy overnight. Look what our founding fathers went through just to get the Constitution. So I conducted a series of hearings on this subject. And the takeaway, and I think I had an article in the New York Times on it, the three pillars of democracy, and see them in the context of what's going on today. First is media. You have to have private media that's focused on reporting the truth and the facts, and also keeping elected officials accountable in both parties, keeping them accountable. What Putin has done in Russia, there's a chapter on that because I represented the guy, Vladimir Kaczynski, who built up the media empire after the Cold War that was being very Western and criticizing government policy and so forth. Putin would have none of it. He put him in jail. And the prosecutor said, you got a choice. You can sign over all your media assets to the state and leave this country, or you're going to stay in prison. So guess what? The Kremlin owns, controls all the media in Russia. Number two is the free and fair elections. You know, this has never been a problem in America. Elections are conducted at the local level, and Democrat, Republican alike. Integrity, all the safeguards. There's never been a problem. I mean, there are little flaws and things get reported, but overall, we've had total confidence in the election system. So what's happening today? Again, it's not what's happening at the precinct level, overseen by county officials. It's social media and how that is now interfering in our election system. And what that means, if we lose confidence, if elections lose their credibility, then everybody's going to dispute the election results. And they can be very divisive in this country. Number three, the rule of law. You've got to have an independent judiciary. And we've always had that. When I was in Congress, the nominations for federal court positions would go to the Senate. It was almost just an automatic approval because the candidates, Democrat and Republican, had the credentials, the legal credentials, the character, were endorsed by the American Bar Association, non-controversial, because their commitment was to the Constitution. But today, many of the nominees, if you look closely, are not so much their credentials as lawyers, but political operatives. Is that what we want in our legal system? So these are challenges to the fundamentals that really hold up what our democracy is about. And when I was in the Foreign Affairs Committee, I traveled worldwide, and I went on many trips. America was always seen as a beacon light of hope and opportunity, how they would look to us for guidance, for leadership, and so forth. And that's kind of disappearing as well. So, in closure, wasn't my intent when I started this book, but I brought it to the end. This is where I think we are. And hopefully my book will be a guide, perhaps, an inspiration for those who want to achieve a higher calling.
Oh, you want to do some Q&A?
Yeah.
All right. First questions from anyone. Please, gentlemen.
I'm concerned that on your last point that we're losing our stature and leadership on the world stage. And I'm wondering, from your experience, what's it going to take? How long will it take? What do we have to do in order to recover that when we have that next opportunity to do so?
A good question. I think it goes beyond whether we can go back to our traditional role as a world leader. China is overtaking America. It's hard to accept. I'm a columnist for the China Daily News. I represent now two of China's largest companies. And so I see evidence of this. China has got its act together. They have these 5 or 7 year plans, very ambitious plans, but the whole country gets behind it. And they achieve their objectives, and they go on to the next. We don't have plans. We have presidential elections. So we go forward. Okay, look at what Barack Obama did in terms of the Paris Accord and infrastructure projects, and goes on healthcare and so forth. And his successor comes in and reverses everything. So step forward, 2 steps backwards. China just keeps going forward. And how can we adjust to that? They're not a military threat at the moment. They're an economic threat. I just want to mention 4 things here. These are the major sectors which demonstrates this transition. When I was in Congress, I served on the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee. We had a maritime industry at the time that was pretty viable. That's before Asia started coming on strong. Maritime industry, that's shipment of all goods plus military equipment when you need it. Today, we have no maritime industry outside just within the bounds of our country up to last week. No more competitive worldwide. China, Costco shipping, the largest in the world. When they first started the port of entry here in 1977, they had a few ships. They now have the largest. We have none. What about rail? Rail's the future. China has the most advanced modern rail system in the world. We have almost 0. When I was in Congress, the money you pay for fuel tax goes into the Highway Trust Fund. And I tried to get a percentage of that towards rails, so we can start building rail systems. But the highway lobby was so powerful, they had a stranglehold on that committee, and none of this was diverted. Technology. Microsoft, Apple, we're way ahead of everyone. But the one area where we've dropped the ball is telecommunications, which happens to be the most important today. And when you look at it, the most advanced technology is called 5G. China's Huawei has put so much money into research. They have advanced way beyond. They are now dominant, not only an economic threat, but a security threat as well. And the fourth, I forgot. Next question. John.
So, how do we get from where we are with division, combativeness in our politics to some kind of civility again, where cross-aisle communications and collaboration can happen and still keep faith with the party's kind of basic ideology?
I wish you would ask an easy question. I mean, that is difficult, and it's kind of aligned with the question I had earlier. Our political system is deteriorating, that's for sure. And it's going to take a sense of unity to make possible the political improvements we need. And right now, the problem isn't just political, it's cultural. It's cultural. I mean, if you look at the dynamics, in this coming election, the red states are going to go red, Republican. The blue states are going to go Democrat. And you get to those 8 or 10 states in between. So usually it takes a horrible crisis to unite a country, as we've experienced in past years. So that's going to be the question and the challenge ahead. But what it's going to take is leadership. And that is decided at the ballot box. I wish I could give you a better answer. Yes? Yeah.
You said the difference is cultural. I'd like to focus on the word cult, because I think that's what's happening in politics.
The word what?
Cult.
Cult. Yeah.
Instead of, well, it's part of cultural, but I think what we're seeing is the development of cult following in political matters, where rationality and experience and background doesn't count anymore.
You know what's interesting, Vance? I wrote an article on this recently, and it's called Populist Authoritarianism. In other words, most of these cult leaders elected by populist constituency are elected at the ballot box. And you look at Brazil and Hungary and Poland and many of these countries, or even Great Britain, they are elected, not come in by military rule or in some way a coup. No, they are elected by the people. And they're exercising almost authoritarian kind of leadership. And what they're starting to do in each case, because I kind of follow this, as I mentioned in those 3 pillars, starting to take control of the media, to kind of interfere a little bit with elections and the rule of law and so forth. So for many years, we've been going down that path of true democracy, and it has shifted. And you can blame the leaders, but they have a political base, and it comes at the ballot box. Okay, we don't want to go, yes?
Just really quick, how do you think, if it's a shared vision that we need, right, and democracy is just organically going to have its different opinions, do you think that it's a leader that we need? What do we need? We don't want to be China, right, and how they govern. Do we need a leader that brings us together under a shared vision, or what do you think did?
Well, again, it gets right back to the ballot box of who that leader is going to be. And, you know, we used to have checks and balances. That's what the Constitution is all about, to make sure that a leader stays within the bounds of the Constitution. And let me cite what's happening just on trade. The Constitution makes very clear, Congress regulates interstate and foreign commerce. The Congress sets the tariff levels and other trade restrictions, not the executive branch. The Congress does. All those tariffs on China at the moment, $360 billion, Congress had no say on. It was done under several laws that deal with national security and executive order. If there had been a Democrat in the Congress, the free trade Republicans would have been very upset with this. But it's by executive order that it's happening, and imposing sanctions. And I have to say that our president, this is really interesting, I don't want to go into one, but our president, his whole background has been business, hasn't it? That's what he's all about, business. He is conducting foreign policy by using sanctions and tariffs and trade restrictions to punish countries. Look at it, Venezuela, Iran, China, and even Europe. He's been threatening more tariffs on Europe automobiles. He's using this as an instrument to punish countries economically. When you think about it, when you conduct foreign policy, number one, you do diplomacy. You negotiate, you rally your allies. Number two is military. He does not want to go down that path. Number three is economic, and that's his sole use of conducting foreign policy. Well, what does that do? That puts a burden on the business community. Some of his staunch supporters are carrying burden because they have to deal with predictability if they're going to have investments and trade agreements and transactions with other countries. But suddenly there's new sanctions or more tariffs. And those tariffs do not punish that other country. I represented 10 of the import trading companies. They are the ones that pay. If the Commerce Department rules because of subsidies or accountability duties or because of the president's executive order, they put that financial burden on the import trading companies. They have to pass it on to the distributors, to the retailers, and ultimately to the consumers. So we have highly politicized the way to do business in this country. And again, other countries, I mean, just take, I gotta stop here, but take China. They retaliated by limiting U.S. agricultural products coming in. And the big one is soybeans, as you know. And it was hefty, their retaliation. Well, our soybean farmers are hurting, and what Trump has done is to use federal money to kind of bail them out, keep the money flowing to them, but they've lost their markets. But meanwhile, China's going to Brazil, and that's going to be their new source. We've lost it. So this is not the way we should be conducting foreign policy, and I'm going to bring this to an end. And thank all of you for coming. Hopefully you'll buy books. Briefly, I will sign them, and we'll have a happy day. Thank you.
We've been coming back. Sometime this year, we're hoping to buy a house again. So and after rent, well, I have too, but you look back on your life and think about the things you do differently. And you never get a chance, of course. Yeah, at the stage you don't have a lot of...
I stay overnight.
Oh, the horizons are approaching fast. One of the things that we do too.
His wife is Japanese.
How do you turn your clock back? Huh? That's part of the problem.
It's nice.
Yeah,
It's different than having your own daughter. She doesn't have the baggage of your daughter. Yeah, so I'm going to go this next
Oh, is that right?
and teach her and her husband Japanese for how to make sugar. I know how to do that. don't really bake. Yeah.
Basically, I couldn't get to work, you know, all really, cutting into my freeze myself.
Just spent,